Hello, I am Dr. Tuğba Günebak. Let's talk a little bit about the microbiota today. When you ask what the microbiota is, I can describe it as the beneficial bacteria that cover our entire body, both inside and out. We can actually describe a strong microbiota as the key to strong health. Research says that microorganisms have been living on Earth for 3.8 million years. We humans, on the other hand, have been around for about 10,000 years. Therefore, the existence of microorganisms dates back long before our own existence, and we have had a relationship with them for a very long time. So, if you ask why this relationship is so important, I have a question for you. Let's see if you can guess the answer. It is said that there are about several trillion cells in the human body, and if I were to ask you what percentage of these are human cells and what percentage are bacterial cells, you would definitely be surprised by the answer I'm about to give. If you have a healthy and strong microbiota, only 10% of the cells in your body are human cells, while the remaining 90% are bacterial cells that make up your microbiota. Therefore, in order to protect our health and to maintain the integrity of our gut barrier, it is extremely important that our relationship with our microbiota remains strong. From the moment we are conceived, when we first enter the womb, our gut and our brain originate from the same cluster of cells, and although they become two separate tissues as they develop because they come from the same cells, they are two organs with a similar number of nerve cells, and their communication continues throughout our lives. In other words, there is an axis, a line of communication between our gut and our brain, and this communication actually causes our gut to be just as sensitive as our brain. Therefore, many of you have probably experienced that your bowel movements also change on days when you are stressed. Therefore, from a comprehensive functional nutrition perspective, it is absolutely vital for us to understand exactly how to effectively strengthen and support the gut microbiota. When we look at it, according to what research says, 1,000 different types of bacteria found in nature and in the human body have been tested. About 160 of these 1,000 bacteria exist in our bodies. So while I have a certain 160 of these 1,000 bacteria in my body, another person has about 160 as well, but in a different distribution. Interestingly, 18 of these bacteria are common to all of us. And research says that people whose microbiota are similar to each other communicate more easily with one another. In fact, some studies suggest that people with similar microbiota are more likely to pair up when choosing a partner. Therefore, even though we may not be aware of it at all, the microbiota actually has a significant impact on our lives. So, can we consider the microbiota as an organ? If we could gather all these beneficial microbes in our bodies and put them in a bag, they would weigh about 2 kilograms and appear as an organ. What does this mean? Even though the microbiota is invisible to the naked eye, we should never forget its existence and should consider it an organ that we must constantly strengthen by choosing the right foods. Because the microbiota supports our health, lives in harmony with us, and multiplies under the right conditions. Let me give you an example. For instance, you have a friend and you notice a cold sore on their face. What does it mean to have a cold sore? It means that a harmful virus called herpes simplex has found a breeding ground there. If this person had a strong pattern of beneficial bacteria in their body, this harmful virus would not have found a place to reproduce. Therefore, in order to protect ourselves from cold sores, fungal infections, and similar types of infections, we need to strengthen our microbiota, which means we should have a diet rich in probiotic foods. Probiotic foods are those that contain beneficial bacteria compatible with the human body. These can be foods that naturally contain such bacteria. For example, foods formed through fermentation like vinegar or homemade yogurt. Or they can also be foods that have had beneficial bacteria added to them externally. Therefore, we need to consume probiotic foods in order to have a strong microbiota. But it's not enough to just have a diet rich in probiotics. In addition, just like Timur fed his elephants, as you may recall from the time of Nasreddin Hoxha, we also need to provide nourishment for these beneficial bacteria. We should think of them as our own soldiers and constantly provide them with sources of nourishment. Therefore, we need to have a diet rich in prebiotic foods, which we define as the food source for probiotic foods. For example, while homemade yogurt is a probiotic food, the oatmeal you eat with it is a prebiotic food. When you consume probiotic and prebiotic foods together, you are practicing symbiotic nutrition. Therefore, consuming probiotics and prebiotics together is called symbiotic nutrition. But current studies say the topic doesn't end here. There are also postbiotics. In other words, when you provide a food source for beneficial bacteria, the bacteria consume it and produce postbiotics, such as short-chain fatty acids, which are very important for strengthening the immune system and for all metabolic activities. So if you ask what we should do to shape the microbiota, of course, this is a very broad topic, and we will discuss it together in our big online class. But here I want to say this, I want to give a few examples. For example, the way you are born affects your microbiota. If you were born naturally, you would have a strong microbiota from the start, but if you were born by cesarean section, then you need to make more effort to strengthen your microbiota. Because when a baby leaves the mother's womb, it comes into contact with the mother's bodily fluids, so the first microbiota it encounters is the mother's. Therefore, the topic of nutrition during pregnancy also comes into play here, which we will discuss. The mother's way of eating, having a strong microbial pattern and having a body rich in beneficial bacteria can enable her baby to have a strong microbiota depending on the mode of birth, giving the baby a head start in life. Now, we said that the microbiota protects us from pathogens and harmful microbes. It strengthens our mucosal barrier. What does this mean? Think about the walls of your intestines. These walls need to be surrounded just like a tightly woven net, closed off with strong barriers. But if you are facing a situation of intestinal permeability, you can imagine that this wall has loosened and there are leakage lines in between. You can picture it like this. If you ask what kind of disadvantage this has, well, while a strong intestinal wall does not allow any foreign substances inside, someone experiencing intestinal permeability may encounter many pathogens and many molecules that can contaminate the body. Therefore, in order to strengthen our intestinal wall, it is important for us to follow a diet that will support our microbiota and reinforce our intestinal barrier. For example, a study was conducted. In this study, they mentioned the following. They selected 2 different groups. In this study, the first group had a very strong intestinal wall, while the second group consisted of individuals with intestinal permeability. We gave both groups meals with the same content. The first group's intestine is smart because its wall is strong. Therefore, it absorbed only as many nutrients from that meal as the body needed. Therefore, it only reached as many calories as it needed. But since the group with high intestinal permeability couldn't regulate what passed through and their intestinal wall was like an open gate, there was no limit to the nutrients entering the body. As a result, they took in much more calories. What does this mean? It means that when you strengthen the intestinal wall while helping someone in the fight against obesity, you can also control the amount of calories they absorb from a meal. We will discuss this in more detail. In addition, it strengthens the immune system and protects against cancer. Important vitamins such as vitamin K and vitamin B12 are synthesized by gut bacteria. Plus, it helps balance the body's pH. It regulates bile acid metabolism, which is very important for the digestive system. Additionally, it also affects our mood, because today we know that the neurotransmitters that affect mood, many molecules such as serotonin, which we call the happiness hormone, are synthesized in the gut. If you have a healthy gut, you will have a strong mood. This means you will be that much more protected from depression. Therefore, having a healthy gut will also help you be more resilient in terms of coping with stress. Along with this, your eating behaviors are also very important. Your food choices, eating habits, the way you cook your food and how you store it will also affect your microbiota and help you have an advantage in terms of gut permeability, allowing you to have a non-permeable gut. We will meet in class to discuss this in much more detail.